one of the first things I learned in Nicaragua, that the audience often does more work than whoever is up performing. So the audience always gets applauded too. It's really special for me to be here because this is my second trip to Iowa and to this university. So it's really nice to come for the first time, but then when they want you back, well, then you feel real good. So I want to thank you. And Iowa's always been real important because, as you'll see, and every time I give versions of this talk, which I've been doing for about, well, since 1981 after my first trip, I change it every couple of weeks, but there's a thematic unity to it. And every time I give the talk, I compare Iowa to Nicaragua because it's the same size and population density. So it's really special to be in there's a real affinity for me between Iowa and Nicaragua because of this. And I think it'll make it even more poignant for you to have a sense of how much money the United States government is putting into destroying the government of Nicaragua. We think of several $100 million put into destroying a country the size and population density of your own state. It gives a perspective to what's going on that most people don't have because the size is always very abstract, but you have a very concrete sense of what would happen to the state if you had hundreds of millions put into building it and helping out the farmers or helping out the universities as opposed to hundreds of millions putting in to destroy. It's kind of a telling comparison. So I'd like to go right into the slides and then we'll have time for questions and answers. The other one not working? Nothing's happened. Thank you. Let me just see if it's... this is not connecting at all. Is there a... Still nothing. Backwards it goes great. Oh. Okay, I got it. In 1954, the democratically elected government of Guatemala was overthrown by a CIA-engineered coup. Since then, over 100,000 Guatemalans, primarily unarmed, primarily Indians, have been murdered by a series of military dictatorships. The poster on the right is referring to two of these dictators, Lucas and Rios Montt, the same thing. The army is the immediate enemy of the Guatemalan people. Guatemala now has a civilian president, but he is really president in name only because even he admits that he has no control over the death squads, which are still running free, murdering civilians. 1963, the Dominican Republic had its first democratic election in over 30 years. Juan Bosch was elected, but there was a right-wing coup. As the democratically elected forces, including the army, were preparing to put Bosch back into the office he had been elected to, President Johnson sent in the Marines in 1965 to make sure that the right wing stayed in power. 1973, another democratically elected government of Salvador Allende in Chile, also overthrown by a CIA-engineered coup. Those of you who've seen the film Missing have a slight indication of the level of brutality and torture that happened under the Pinochet government, which is still in power today. The poster on the right doesn't need translations, but it's an interesting cast of characters. Pinochet, the military dictator, is with the sunglasses. Behind him, two presidents of the US, Ford and Nixon. And behind Nixon's shoulder, you have Henry Kissinger. Kissinger was the architect of the brutal policy in Chile. He's also one of the prime architects of the miserable policy in Central America today. In 1983, the tiny island of Grenada, with a population of just about 100,000, was invaded by over 5,000 US troops. Grenada is still occupied today, and many people look upon the invasion of Grenada as a rehearsal and a threat for the invasion of Nicaragua. Nicaragua is a very small country, as I mentioned, the size and population density of Iowa, with about 3 million people. Borders on the north with Honduras, south with Costa Rica, and long coasts on the Atlantic and Pacific. Nicaragua is a very beautiful country, very plush tropical landscape lots of lakes and rivers, and lots of active volcanoes. And the image of the volcano is so prominent in the Nicaraguan landscape that you see it entering the popular art. This poster was made just after the 1979 overthrow of the Somoza dictatorship, and it compares the power of the volcano erupting with the power of the people erupting in revolution. Above the fist, there's a quote from a hero from the 1920s and 30s, Augusto Cesar Sandino, and he says, "I swear before the country and before history that my sword will defend," I can't read it from here, "that my sword will defend the national honor and will be redemption for the oppressed." Below it says, "Nicaragua now is free. Our liberation is the war to the death against malnutrition and illness." You'll also notice that the volcano in the front is red and black. These are the symbolic colors of the revolution, and you'll see these colors combined quite frequently. It's very difficult in the brief time I have here to go over what the situation of art in Nicaragua in the revolution, and also talk about what were the causes of revolution. It would take a whole seminar, and we still wouldn't have the answers to why revolution happens. But certainly one of the main causes is the level of poverty. At the time of the overthrow of the dictator, 70% of the people living in the capital were without running water, without basic sanitation facilities. Now, a capital is usually the international showcase. It has the highest standard of living generally than any other place in the country, so this gives you an indication of the poverty that Nicaragua had under the dictatorship. Houses like this on the left, dirt floor shacks, 2 or 3 generations of people living in a shack like this. This one's actually kind of lucky because it has corrugated metal roof, which is a little bit more watertight than just wood with some cardboard stuck in it, as many of the homes had. And of course, this is walking distance from houses that look like this. So this extreme difference between a few living in incredible wealth by anybody's standards and the majority that lived in abject poverty was obviously a major contributing factor, but it was not the only factor. Photos like this we see in National Geographic a lot, tourist photos seen as very, quaint images, the poor women washing their clothes in the river, very pretty, but of course not pretty for them. Again, an indication of the abject poverty. What we don't think about when we usually see pictures like this is that not only are they washing in the river, but they're drinking the same water, and this leads to lots of diseases. The image on the left, the girl, is 4 years old. I don't know if she survived. This is really the ultimate, I think, cause, the ground line cause for revolution, was when people see their children die from diseases associated with malnutrition, or diseases that they could cure if they could afford a doctor and afford medical care, and they can't. But they'll see a few hundred yards away that vets are called in from another city to take care of the birth of a prize cow, but their own child can't get medical treatment. And after seeing children die for reasons that could be prevented, I think this was probably the bottom line for people, and they said enough, and they decided to change the system. The image on the right, again, another image of poverty, a woman doing daycare for her 5 kids, and I really empathize with that photo now. I only have 1, but she's 1 year old, and I can imagine this woman with 5 and making just barely subsistence living with selling paper goods for candles for church. And if you look at how art treats these kinds of images, as the mural on the left, you see it tends to idealize and make it, again, a very beautiful, picturesque view of what is reality, a very difficult life. So you see the Indian women in the mural, very beautifully selling their wares underneath the image of the church, which is very prominent in the Nicaraguan life. Another detail from the mural on the left, this mural, by the way, is in one of the large modern, practically the only large modern supermarket in Nicaragua. It was walking distance from the villa where the dictator himself lived. It was a very expensive supermarket, not the kind that most of us shop. Prices were very expensive, comparable to the United States. Usually imported goods from the United States were in the market. And if you look at the detail on the left again, there's 2 men, one with the beard and mustache, the other with the basket and the chicken, the Indian. And the man with the beard and the mustache is a Spaniard. And so the message that we get from this detail is that the Spanish fairly purchased or traded whatever goods they wanted from the indigenous population. Of course, we know from history that this is a lie. The Spanish just stole whatever they wanted. But again, this is a very typical use of art which creates a myth of the past that never existed, an idealization. And the Nicaraguans are very conscious of the fact that unless you understand your past, unless you understand your history, you don't understand how you got where you are today, and therefore you really don't have the ability to change the future, to control your own destiny. And of course, this is not just typical for Nicaraguan art before the revolution. We could look at Egyptian art, Roman art, Greek art, and of course US art. If it's sponsored by the government, it tends to give a view, and it doesn't even have to be sponsored by the government, it has to be sponsored by sponsors. Okay, if you look at the advertisers like Xerox and IBM sponsoring the TV shows, again, it's going to have a view of reality that is not necessarily reality, but the view they would like us to think reality is. I like to compare it with our own Indian head nickel. It has the word liberty over the head of the Indian. I think the point is made. Okay, that's as big a piece of lying propaganda as one could imagine. Obviously, the Indians have never had liberty in this country. Another mural painted right after the revolution, and this is also in a marketplace which has several galleries, and this is part of an exhibit dedicated to 20 years of struggle. And you'll see that here the Indians and the Spanish are shown in a very different relationship. The Spanish are showing as enslaving and massacring the Indians. You'll also notice there are 3 different styles of painting in this mural, 2 of which you see here. Each style indicates a different political reality. So on the left, you have the bright colored, flat, 2-dimensional style associated with the indigenous culture, and as soon as the Spanish come on the right, you see the style changing to a 3-dimensional, illusionistic European style. In the middle of the right, you'll also notice a crucifix made up of the Spanish spears and the indigenous symbols of the intertwined snakes. The Spanish conquered with 2 weapons. The first weapon, military; the second weapon, religion. After taking control politically by forcing conversion on the indigenous population, by forcing them to become Catholics, it was a way of separating them from their own culture and therefore making them easier to control. Under Catholicism, people were also taught, don't complain about your lot in life now, you'll receive your reward in the next life. And so it was another form of control. Nicaragua is still a very religious country, 80 to 85% Catholic, 10 to 15% Protestant. And if you were to travel throughout Nicaragua, you probably could find a religious procession, such as the one on the left, at any week of the year in a different community, where the whole town will follow behind the statues of the local patron saint. This dance is called El Güeguense. It's the oldest recorded dance after the arrival of the Spanish. And if you look at the face, blonde hair, blue eyes, blonde mustache, it's clearly the face of a Spaniard. But this was not a dance to entertain the Spanish. This was a dance which the Indians developed as a way of dealing with their own oppression, because the dialogue made a mockery of the Spanish. It put the Spanish down. And at certain times in the history, the dialogue was actually used to organize people to revolt. So this is a very early use of art, of culture, in social protest. This is a mask from a different community, but also using Spanish faces. But now this mask is being used to hide the identity of young people, teenagers, who are fighting against the Somoza dictatorship using homemade hand grenades or contact bombs. This is a photograph taken in 1978 by New York photojournalist Susan Meiselas, who was one of the first North Americans to thoroughly document visually the Nicaraguan Revolution. The Spanish took over in the early 16th century and left in the early 19th century. When they left Nicaragua in 1821, the United States immediately became interested, in fact, in all of Central America. So you see the map superimposed over the U.S. flag. In Nicaragua, there was gold and silver, and by the middle of the 19th century, U.S. banks controlled all of these minerals. To this day, the Nicaraguans have no idea how many tons of the minerals were removed from their country because no records are kept which were accessible to the Nicaraguans. Then in 1848, gold was discovered in California. Now this was before there was a canal, and this was before there was a cross-continental railway. So the people on the east coast of the United States were looking for a relatively fast way of getting to the west coast, finding their fortune, and then going back again. By stagecoach across the states, it took about 6 months, so that wasn't the preferred route. 5 steamship companies decided to take people by boat to Panama, stagecoach across Panama because, again, it was the shortest land piece to cross, and then boat the other end. But Cornelius Vanderbilt, the man you see in the middle of the right slide with the brown jacket, balding, surrounded by bags of money and cheap peasant labor, he decided to take advantage of all those lakes and rivers in Nicaragua, and he took 5 days off the trip. So his route became the most popular, and in 19th century dollars, not 20th century inflated figures, Vanderbilt profited a minimum of $1 million a year just taking people through Nicaragua. The Nicaraguans, by the way, didn't get any of that money. So Vanderbilt obviously had a strong interest in keeping access through Nicaragua. A few years later, another aspect of U.S. history had a direct impact on Nicaragua. The Civil War broke out in 1860, but as you have in any war, you have a period of increasing tension, increasing hostility, where sides are being drawn. So this is the case in 1855, just preceding the Civil War. The man you see in the upper right-hand corner in the blue jacket and the shackles, his name is William Walker. He was a slave owner from Tennessee. He practiced law for a while in California, and in fact, there's a film being made of him right now that we're working on with a U.S. company in Nicaragua, and it should be released, I think, before the end of the year. I'm not recommending it, I'm just saying there's one. I haven't seen it, so I don't know what kind of story it will tell. But Walker went down to Nicaragua in 1855 with a mercenary army, threw out the president of Nicaragua, made himself president, received diplomatic recognition by the U.S. government as official president of Nicaragua, installed English as the official language because he didn't want to bother learning Spanish, and reinstituted slavery, which had been abolished when Nicaragua became independent from Spain. The purpose of this was a long-range plan, which actually included Mexico and all of Central America. But the idea was to annex Nicaragua as a slave state into the southern United States, pushing the balance of power in favor of the slave states of the South and against the abolitionist states of the North. Fortunately for all of us, this plan did not succeed because 2 years later, 1857, Walker was thrown out by an army from what are now the countries of Guatemala, El Salvador, and Costa Rica. This army was in part subsidized by Cornelius Vanderbilt because Walker took over Vanderbilt's $1 million a year steamship line through Nicaragua. So you had the U.S. players in a bit of conflict of interests. But the image of the shackles in Walker's hand are a very prominent image in the Nicaraguan art today, the shackles being broken. We won, we are free, we will never again return to be slaves, and this refers to the slavery under the Spanish, the slavery under William Walker, and the slavery under the Somoza dictatorship. U.S. Marines invaded Nicaragua 10 times during the 19th and 20th centuries. 9 of those times was before the Soviet Union even existed. So when Ronald Reagan tries to tell us that this is an East-West conflict, he wants us to forget our own history as well. The photo on the right was taken during the U.S. occupation in 1927. Now one would assume, because of the very frequent and brutal history of U.S. intervention in Nicaragua, that there would be a lot of anti-U.S. sentiment, and that this would then be reflected in the art. And one of the things that I have tried to document is the anti-U.S. sentiment in the art, and I've always found some, but I've always been very surprised at how relatively little I have found given the history. The strongest anti-U.S. image I ever found was this one. It's a larger-than-life-size mural. By the way, it no longer exists. It was whitewashed sometime between 1983 and 1984, but it was there and painted between 80 and 81. And it's a larger-than-life-size image of a U.S. Marine. His face is a skull. He has a U.S. flag across his chest, and he is holding and is surrounded by decapitated heads. I confess when I first saw this mural, I was totally turned off. I said, well, you have exaggerations on all sides. I mean, you can be anti-U.S., but this is a pretty hideous image of being anti-U.S. And then 3 years ago, Rolling Stone magazine published a series of photos from the U.S. National Archives in Washington, D.C., taken by the Marine Corps, documenting their own occupation of Nicaragua in the late 20s. And I came across this photo. It's a U.S. Marine. He's holding the head of a Nicaraguan who dared to fight against the occupation. It's a signed and dated photo, Matagalpa, 1930. And I've subsequently met the researcher that uncovered this, and she told me that on the back of it there's a little penciled notation that says, "I don't think this photo should be made public." Well, it's pretty obvious why not. Apparently I've also subsequently learned that this was fairly standard procedure, that the Marines would decapitate the heads of leaders of the resistance in Nicaragua, put them outside their own towns on a pole as a way of terrorizing the community into submission. Don't fight back, this is what will happen to you. So, I mean, the very fact that this photograph was taken, I think, can only remind us of the concentration camps and the Nazis, bragging about that. A lot of people have responded to the photo saying, yes, it's horrible, but it's over 50, almost 60 years ago, and this kind of thing doesn't happen any longer. This is a photograph of a drawing done by an 11-year-old El Salvadoran child. She drew what she saw happen to her parents by the Army of El Salvador, an army whose entire military budget, military equipment, and military training comes from U.S. tax dollars. Well over $1 billion have been poured into the Salvadoran army. And again, we have to take credit for this. She's now a refugee living in England. And then in 2 years ago, a U.S. college student published a couple of photos in Newsweek and Life magazine that you may have seen. This is one of them. He supports the Reagan's mercenary terrorist army known as the Contras. And he got their permission to travel with them while they do their work, because he liked their work. And they gave him permission, and he traveled with them, and he photographed them with a Nicaraguan prisoner of war. They made him dig his own grave, lie in it, and then slit his throat while he was still alive. And then he came back and he sold the photos to Newsweek and Life. And he is someone who supports the Contras. So again, this is brought to you by U.S. tax dollars. The U.S., just focusing on the 20th century interventions, the U.S. Marines invaded Nicaragua in 1910, again, before the Soviet Union existed. The Russian Revolution hadn't happened yet. Because in 1910, the president of Nicaragua was working out a trade agreement with Great Britain. Great Britain was considered an economic rival to the United States, and using the Monroe Doctrine as a justification, the U.S. administration decided that we have the right to decide who is going to do business with whom in this hemisphere. So the Nicaraguan president was thrown out, a puppet was put in, and the Marines occupied Nicaragua from 1910 to 1926. They left in 26 thinking that things were under control. Excuse me, that was 1912 to 1926. Left in 26 thinking that things were under control, but they were wrong. A guerrilla war had started, and the death toll started against the puppet government was rising, so the Marines were sent back in 1927, and they stayed until 1934. During the second stage of this occupation of Nicaragua, an anti-intervention movement began in the United States comparable to the anti-intervention movement that's going on today around U.S. involvement in Central America. I never knew that this existed, even though I was a history major at university, because it's not in your standard class textbooks. And this shouldn't be surprising, because if you look into the high school textbooks now and you look up Vietnam War, you're lucky to find a paragraph. So again, we have a problem keeping in touch with our own history when it's something that's not very popular. These are two editorial cartoons from U.S. newspapers in 1927, 1928. On the left is Calvin Coolidge, who, by the way, is one of Reagan's heroes. Often in press conferences you'll find a photograph of Coolidge in the back of Reagan. And he has the government bulletin board of the excuses used to justify the intervention in Nicaragua. Alibi number one, it's a red plot. I mean, every single one of these things 50 years later we're hearing still. Alibi number two, we're neutral. Alibi number three, we're defending American lives and property. That is verbatim what they said before going into Grenada. And alibi number four, to safeguard the paper rights in an unbuilt canal. This is actually being revived, because the Panama Canal will probably be obsolete by the year 2000 for the supertankers. It will be too small. So again, the people are looking for another route, a Nicaraguan potential route, which Nicaragua was originally the first choice for the canal before Panama was chosen, because of all those lakes and rivers. So again, Nicaragua is a potential canal site that's being looked at, and again, the United States wants to be able to control it. If you don't like these excuses, I'll think of another. On the right, another editorial cartoon. If this isn't intervention, what is it? Again, a sarcastic denial of intervention going on. It's like when the CIA mined the Nicaraguan harbor and said, who else? No, we didn't do it. When the Marines came back in 26, as I mentioned, a guerrilla war started. When they came back in 27. And the body bag count was so high that, as I mentioned again, the protests started on the streets of the United States. They didn't want any more U.S. boys getting killed, with good reason. The reason that the guerrilla war was so successful was because of the man we see in both the photograph and the mural, Augusto Cesar Sandino. You see him in the checkered shirt in the photo and in the third style of the painting, the style of the revolution, the style of the red and black. Next to Sandino, in both the photo and the mural, is a Salvadoran by the name of Farabundo Martí. The two of them fought together in Nicaragua against the U.S. occupation in the 20s and 30s, and it's very important for us to remember that the revolutionary movements that started in Nicaragua and El Salvador in the 1960s and 70s take their name and their inspiration from these two men from the 1920s. So the guerrilla movement in El Salvador calls itself the Farabundo Martí Liberation Front, after Farabundo on the right. And of course the Sandinistas in Nicaragua take their name from Sandino. They couldn't beat Sandino, but in deference to the increasing protest at home, they decided to pull the U.S. troops out. This was the same thing that happened during the Vietnam War. When the protests became too loud, it was too disruptive of our situation in the United States, that the U.S. troops were pulled out of Vietnam, and the idea was to Vietnamize the war. In other words, have the South Vietnamese fight as surrogates using U.S. weapons, U.S. direction, but they would be fighting as surrogates for the United States. Therefore, U.S. boys wouldn't be dying, just third world boys would be dying, and then nobody would care. This was the idea. This was the same idea in Nicaragua. Take the U.S. boys home, you'll have third world boys killing each other, and nobody in the streets of LA is going to mind anymore. They found a Nicaraguan living in Pennsylvania. He was selling used cars before he went to work for the Rockefeller Foundation. His name, Anastasio Somoza. And they made him head of the Nicaraguan Marine Corps, which they call the National Guard. You see him in the middle of the right slide, being controlled by the hand coming down from the top, which is the hand of the United States, controlling the marionette of Somoza. Somoza himself is holding a puppet, and it is the puppet of a cousin of his by the name of Sacasa, who was also the president, but the president really in name only, because Somoza had the total power. After a couple of years, not even a couple of years, it was about 10 or 12 months, Somoza decided he wanted the prestige going along with the power, and so he kicked out the president and made himself president for life. We've heard that title before, most recently in Haiti, and also maintained the title of head of the National Guard. He received U.S. honors, diplomatic recognition by our own government. Here he's shown with Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who characterized Somoza very bluntly. He said, Somoza is a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch. They couldn't beat Sandino, so they invited him. This was again worked out with the United States government. They invited Sandino to a peace treaty, and this one Sandino came down to sign the peace treaty. On the far left, you see Somoza, in the center Sandino, and to his right is Sacasa. Immediately following the signing of the peace treaty, Sandino was assassinated. This was in February of 1934. The role of the United States in literally stabbing Sandino in the back after the signing of the peace treaty should give us all some serious pause to think about the current peace negotiations right now with the Guatemalan peace plan, known as the Arias Plan, which the U.S. government is trying very hard to undermine. And given the history of U.S. respect to peace plans in the region, I think that the Nicaraguans have a good deal to be cautious about. The skull with the word democracy across it is not democracy as I would assume, as I would hope everyone in this room believes democracy is supposed to be. It is democracy in name only. In substance, in form, it is dictatorship, it is death. It is what the Reagan administration referred to when he talked about the government of Marcos as a good democratic ally until he was forced to step back from that position. It was what he meant more recently when he talked about the government of South Korea as a good democratic ally, and he's having to pull back from that position as well. But I think the most telling meaning for the total subversion of democracy is what was revealed in the recent Contragate hearings, when the highest government officials of this country totally thwarted the Constitution of the United States, disregarded it. I mean, the quote has been shredded it. And because they didn't like what Congress voted, they decided they were above the law. And if they're able to do that to the government in this country, democracy here is under attack. And we need to be very aware of that, because unless we work to struggle to defend democracy at home, we're all going to be in problems. The first Somoza was assassinated in 1956 by a poet, Rigoberto Lopez Perez. You see that also on the left slide. But this is what we call a hereditary presidency. Somoza had 2 sons, each of whom became president. Now, Nicaragua is not a climate conducive to football. But if it's made in the United States, it's considered to be very, very popular. The younger son, number 17, received his military training at West Point. He preferred to speak English. He considered it demeaning to speak Spanish. His name, same as the father, Anastasio Somoza. And he became president after his brother died. You see him again in the middle of the mural, surrounded by the National Guard. Beneath him is an image of rape. It's possible that the son was even more brutal than the father, because this is a symbol of the rape of the country, the rape of Nicaragua. Things became so bad that in 1961, the second guerrilla war in Nicaragua's history started, taking its name and its inspiration from Sandino. So the initials that you see, FSLN, stands for the Sandinista National Liberation Front. The man that you see next to the initials, also in the red and black style, his name is Carlos Fonseca. He was one of the founders of the FSLN in 1961, and as many of the Nicaraguans, he is a poet. And one of his poems refers to the new day, the new dawn, the sunrise of the people. We no longer have to be afraid of the new day. For the first time in our history, the future is within our own control. And that's the meaning of the sunburst behind his head, and it's a very popular image in the Nicaraguan art. This is a social welfare building. Out of the rays of the rising sun come the revolutionary fist. A cultural center with portraits of Fonseca and Sandino on the sides, and again, the rising sun with the initials FSLN. In 1973, there was a devastating earthquake in Managua. 15,000 people were killed. 170,000 people were left homeless. We've had recent earthquake tragedies in Mexico City, in San Salvador. LA had by these standards, LA got off light a couple of weeks ago. But still, this was one of the worst tragedies that we've seen. The international aid that was sent was very, very high, but the medicine, the food, the blankets, all the aid that was sent down on this level was not given to the people who needed it. Somoza gave it to the National Guard. They sold it to the people who needed it on the black market. So this is how Somoza kept the Guard in control, by giving them these fringes. But Somoza looked out for himself as well, because he had the only cement factory, the only construction company, and the best land outside the earthquake fault area. So if you needed your house or your business repaired or rebuilt, or you needed to build from scratch outside the earthquake fault range, you had to go to Somoza. Before the earthquake, Somoza's worth about $250 million. This is as an individual. A few years after the earthquake, he was worth over $500 million. So he didn't even help his traditional allies, the middle classes, help get their businesses reestablished. And following the earthquake, the Sandinistas received a lot of support from across the board, from all classes of Nicaraguan society. There's also a little side story in the mural on the left. You see those veins, blood veins coming in and out of bags of money. He had a little side business that he had with a doctor who left Cuba when Castro came to power. And Somoza and this Cuban doctor set up a blood bank. Now, at this point in time, we had a population in Nicaragua of just about 2 million, and half of them were under 15 years old and very poor. And by inviting the poor in, giving them a little food, giving them a little money, and taking blood, Somoza became the largest supplier of whole blood in the world to the United States. Out of this, again, a population smaller than Iowa at that time. He profited a $12 million a year with this little side business. So it's no wonder they called him the vampire, that he literally was sucking the blood and selling the blood of his own people. Some of you may remember when ABC News correspondent Bill Stewart was assassinated. He was broadcasting in the capital of Managua. He was unarmed. The National Guard made him prove that he was unarmed, which he did by kneeling and putting his arms out, but then he was shot point blank in the head. There was a fictionalized version of this event that in the film called Under Fire, where another newspaper reporter was murdered, but truth is stranger than fiction, because not only was he murdered, but the video camera was going the whole time, and the footage was broadcast internationally. President Carter, at that point, when everybody saw this the massacre, was forced to invoke his human rights policy and say, no more aid to Somoza. And many of us believed him, including myself. Subsequently found out that Carter had a couple of loopholes which he kept for himself. The first loophole, he said no more aid to Somoza, but any aid that had already been promised continued to be sent. This is a warehouse full of U.S. weapons which Somoza didn't even get to open. So when you'll have some Congress people, I've heard, and others say that the Sandinistas only came to power because the United States let them, because the United States cut Somoza off. This is not true. Somoza never ran out of U.S. weapons. And even if he was coming close, there was that second loophole that Carter had, and that was the use of surrogate nations. When U.S. weapons were going to run out, Carter made sure that other nations would supply Somoza with all the weapons he needed. The prime surrogates that Carter used was Israel and Argentina. This was the same loophole that the Reagan administration used when temporarily Congress had the guts to cut off aid to the Contras. Because, well, of course, now we know with the Contragate hearings, the elaborate way that they went to sell arms to the Iranians, who we also call terrorists, and then take that money and give it to the Contras. But there are also surrogate nations, especially El Salvador and Honduras, that helped the Contras get U.S. aid diverted to them. And of course, the third way of getting aid to the Contras, which Senator Kerry from Massachusetts is really the only one who's really pushing right now, is the drug connection. There's a Christic Institute suit, I don't know how many of you have heard of that, it's also dealing with the drug connection. The CIA planes that have been taking the weapons down to the Contras in Nicaragua don't come back empty. They come back full of drugs. And the CIA allows them to come back full of drugs. They are then sold in the United States. This money is then used to buy more weapons, and then send them back to the Contras. So this has been going back and forth. It's very well documented, and it is absolutely, I mean, it's almost too horrible to believe. And if I hadn't read document after document after document, I wouldn't be telling you this because I would have trouble accepting it myself. I do have trouble accepting it, but it's true. In spite of the unending aid to the Somoza dictatorship, the Nicaraguan people won their independence on July 19, 1979. Notice in the mural, as well as in the documentary photo, you have women as well as men in arms. There's been a tremendous outpouring of music, of poetry, of theater, of dance, and painting since the overthrow of Somoza. And I'm going to show you several instances of the artwork. This building has 3 murals. The first side, actually, you already saw the detail, the Victorious Homecoming. The second side is a very different style called the Primitivist style, one of the most popular in Nicaragua today. And if you look at details from this mural and compare it with the street life, you'll see how closely they relate. On the left, you have the woman carrying a basket on her head, of course, a typical street scene. On the left, you have the horse-drawn taxi, also very typical, especially with the war, with the shortage of gasoline, with the U.S. embargo against Nicaragua, they're having to develop alternate forms of transportation. And on the left, you have graffiti on the wall, and graffiti is a national pastime in Nicaragua. The idea is you put your political views on somebody else's wall, so you have all kinds of graffiti everywhere. Another detail from the mural compared with poor in the rural areas. When I took the photo on the right, the bus had broken down, we all had to get off, and I said, oh, isn't this beautiful with the flowers and the thatched roof, and the fog was rolling in. There really were pigs and chickens running around. It was only after I got home and I was looking at my slides and I became extremely embarrassed that I remembered my attitude when I took the picture. I took the picture because I thought, isn't it pretty? And then I realized that I had just total distance from the poverty in this situation. Try hard as I did, to leave my 1980s Southern California self home with me, you can't do that. I mean, you can't just unzip self and step out. And so I was constantly confronted with a not terribly attractive view of myself from the eyes of another society. Each of the trips I was down in Nicaragua, I've been down 3 times, I stayed with a middle-class family. And the woman is a nurse, the man is an accountant. And this, I don't have a photo of their house, but this is her mother. And that's her mother's house. And the mother used to be a cook for one of Somoza's relatives before the war. And after she swore she wasn't going to be anyone's servant again, and so she and her husband rent a small piece of land. They're farmers, they're very poor, and take away 3 people from this photo, and the rest of them live in this basically 1.5 room dirt floor shack. On the right, she's making lunch for us. That's the kitchen, living room, dining room, family room. And there was no electricity for miles, and yet there's this electric light bulb hanging. And so I asked, after a while, I said, how come you have this electric light bulb? Because I don't think there was electricity for 50, 60 miles. And she said, well, there's never been electricity in this area, but the Sandinistas promised to bring it. And so it's easier to wire the house as you're building it than later. So that's what we did. And it was almost like an icon hanging up there, waiting for the light to come through. So I said, well, you've got more faith in your government than I'd have, but good luck. So this is in 1981. I went back in 83, and I asked her daughter, I said, well, did they get their electricity yet? And she said, yes, they did. And now they're waiting for the next promise, which is running water. I went back in 84, and I checked again. I said, well, did they get the running water yet? And she said, no, they didn't, and the Contras had cut the electric lines. So basically, they were back to where they had been before. And you could see this pattern repeatedly, that the incredible advances made in the early years of the revolution in areas of health care and literacy and standard of living were all the areas that the Contras attack. They don't attack the army, they attack the civilian advances. You'll also notice the FSLN initials on the left. They were very, very pro-Sandinista. They put their own FSLN on the wall of their house, but they were also open in their criticisms. And one of their criticisms was that they were still very poor, the revolution hadn't helped them get rich, and the Sandinistas wouldn't even help them get pesticides, and they were too poor to purchase it. Now, I know nothing about gardening, okay? I'm one of these people that should not be allowed to own houseplants because they all die within 2 weeks, either overwatered or usually underwatered, it's usually by neglect. But everyone from Southern California knows that organic gardening is better. And so I opened my mouth, and in not very grammatically correct Spanish, I said, oh, you're better off without pesticides, organic gardening is better, and I went on to make a total fool of myself. And they were very polite. They weren't rude like I deserved, and instead they invited me to come with them into the field. And I went, and they showed me how they spend between 8 and 10 hours every day hand-picking the worms off of the corn so the crops aren't destroyed. And you know about cornfields better than I did at that point. You just don't have to touch anything, but it touches you. They're real close together. And at the end of my 15 or 20 minutes in that cornfield, I had those worms everywhere. I had them in my hair, I had them on my clothes. And if I had access to any pesticide, I probably would have taken a bath in it and then said, enjoy it, don't worry about the warning label, just, sorry I opened up my big mouth. But this is, again, another example of how I was confronted with myself in a not very flattering way. 2 more details, on the right is one of the about 20,000 new houses that have been built specifically to replace the level of poverty that you see on the left. This is not middle-class housing. This is housing for the working poor. people pay what they can afford to pay. But there's a great shortage of, they probably need over 100,000 such as housing such as this. There are a lot of international groups from the United States, from Europe, that are volunteering, building these houses. But this is, again, one of the areas that the contras are tapped. If you burn the house down, you're having to divert all that many more resources into building it up again. Two more details from the mural, and these are showing a school lesson on the left. On the right, a demonstration, people holding banners saying literacy is liberation. We turn the corner, the third mural on this building, a very different style again, very modern, but also dealing with literacy. One of the legacies of the Somoza years was a 56% national illiteracy rate. That's over half the population, including the people in the cities. Over half the population could not read and write. And the Nicaraguans understood that just by getting rid of the dictatorship, a democracy doesn't form instantaneously. A democracy is something that has to be developed, it has to be created, it has to be nurtured. And people need the tools to create a democratic society. They need to be fed, they need to be clothed, they need to be housed, and they need to be able to read and write. And so there was a tremendous campaign to teach people how to read and write. And it was developed by a brilliant